Thank you, Yuri, and apologize for the folks. We are a few minutes behind, but Yuri was running off another call. Uh, so thank you for joining us here, Yuri. A little bit of context. I met Yuri when you were still at CSO Insights, and
Mhm.
you were doing some sort of research on like tools and technologies and things that happened in the sales operation and sales strategy space. So now you've moved on. Uh, but you've had an interesting background. Do you want to share a little bit about your background? And I'll also be interested in like why you decided to go back into an ops role from an analyst role.
Sure. My career in sales operations probably started when I joined Symantec as a sales associate, really kind of the frontline, entry level role in sales. And from there, moved into sales enablement for various reasons, which was primarily sales training back then. And this was probably close to around 19 years ago is when my kind of foray into the sales ops world started. And through various experiences, including program project management and also change management, I was able to then kind of jump more into the sales operations side of the operations world that back then was primarily enablement and operations joint. And once I had done that, for various reasons, I kind of took a little bit of a break and went from the large enterprise organizations like Symantec Veritas to smaller companies like a Vidyard and Docutech that were really more startup growth mode. So very different situation, but still in sales operations. And having had both types of experience in different market segments and different company sizes, it was the right timing to look at becoming a research analyst when the opportunity kind of knocked on my door. And I hadn't really considered it, but having always been interested in learning new things and sharing new things, it was an area that piqued my interest, and I was able to join the CSO Insights team. And it was a great experience, having done some surveys, shared some best practices, having met with a lot of technology companies such as Fullcast to kind of really understand what are the technologies that are out there that sales and sales ops can leverage. And it just so happened that this opportunity at Akamai came along as well. And unfortunately, with CSO Insights, the research focus got decreased around the same time, which is kind of a shame. But I had two career trajectories for anybody in operations that might have this opportunity. One was to continue in the research area, or two, to go back into sales operations. And while I really enjoyed research and actually see myself going back in there maybe down the road when I'm ready to retire or something, being able to take what I learned from best practices that I compiled and was part of creating a dialogue around, it really was an opportunity to try to see if I can apply those best practices in reality again, going back into a sales operations role. And that's why I made the decision to jump back into operations now currently at Akamai Technologies.
Okay. Excellent. So I think that'll dovetail right into this topic that we're having, right? So aligning sales strategy to execution, right? That's been a challenge, and for most organizations, how do you see the two working together? Like a lot of organizations have a sales strategy function,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them actually just have sales operations. There's no strategy function, right?
Yeah.
And so, through how do you think about those two roles?
I think they're very much intricately connected. And if it's not, operations has an opportunity to kind of make that connection. In our current state at Akamai, I think we're lucky in that sales operations is viewed as a strategic function and partner. We have, some areas that we're still building on our foundations to strengthen our capability, but having that executive support to understand the value of what sales operations can provide is probably one step closer to helping sales operations teams and leaders be more involved in the strategic discussion. Right, operations typically, I think, is seen as that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the execution of the plan happens. And depending on your organization and company's dynamic, you have to keep that in mind. It's not hey, this best practice, one size fits all works for everybody. There's a lot of organizational and stakeholder alignment that you need to drive if you feel today operations is slightly treated or engaged separately from a strategy discussion. I've been fortunate enough to work in other companies like Symantec or Veritas, where there were leaders that really saw kind of the merging of the operations and strategic discussion. And if it doesn't exist today, one of the ways you can do this is operations can play a key role in facilitating that strategic dialogue. And, a lot of times these leadership discussions happen, but it may be ad hoc, or it may be more at the executive level without the presence of those who know what it takes to execute a plan, translating strategy into an executionable plan. That's probably the most complex part that understandably our leaders should not have to worry about. But that means it would be ideal as operations is part of that discussion, so that we not only understand what the strategic decisions that are being made, but we can also become the operations experts to also recommend alternate considerations, especially if we feel executing a strategy may be more challenging. And is it worth the level of effort it's going to take to execute that strategy? It's not to say no, it's more of a, if we are to do this, here's some recommendations or risks to be aware of. Would you be open to other considerations? So that really helps you be the expert, because you're providing alternate considerations even at the strategic discussion level that maybe leaders hadn't thought about.
So do you see that happening a lot? Because in practice, like when we were in my prior roles, right, we had a sales strategy team. Generally, a lot of MBAs. They came out of school. Then actually, a lot of them never actually carried Quota, to be honestly. But they had a strategy background, and they came and they built the strategy, and it was kind of thrown over the wall to be then executed by the ops team. And ops team was just so focused on just making the trains run that I don't know whether they actually got their input back into the plan, right? The plan was built in an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm not sure how have you seen that work out?
It's a good question. I think it varies with each organization as well, but I've seen both situations where these strategies based on best practices, which is the world I come from, are built on, and then ops has to figure out how to execute. I think what has worked when it has worked is when, even as those decisions are being made, let's say parallel, even without operations being part of those strategic discussions, the leaders, whether it's a sales leader or another executive, is able to then engage operations in parallel, sharing those discussion points to say, can we do this? What is it going to take? Now, that's a hard item to ask for, because that works on the assumption that there's some level of kind of partnership established with whoever might be that leader, whether it's a sales leader or even a global operations leader, let's say, or even COO that might be part of those discussions. But what I can say from firsthand experience is, but when you are doing it the right way and even pulling those strategic recommendations, you are also vetting out operational considerations. You can go into those strategic discussions with, here are things to be aware of as a potential risk factor for these kind of strategy that we want to go to market with, and be proactive about it. I think we have enough past experience in executing various plans against strategic decisions. Even that would be helpful for our leaders before they go into a strategic level discussion. So in the cases where outside firms are coming in, or typically a lot of inexperienced, MBAs. What I've seen also work really well in those scenarios is when we partner with, really, we have the partner level engagement, right, which is more at the strategic level. Then you also have kind of the new hires in those organizations that are really the so-called analysts that we have access to. Typically, what has worked is when we've been able to engage with those analysts to try to figure out with their help, well, we need analysis on this to try to operationalize this. And then we have that kind of communication even with the outside consulting groups that are in, because the analysts are treated as part of the extended team, that we conduct a lot of very business and your organization specific analysis to try to execute that plan. And I have seen some of that work where there is a partnership, a true partnership with the analysts that are coming from the outside firms that are supporting your organization, especially with the sales operations team.
Yeah, I think that the tight partnership when they're involved in the planning cycle, uh, and they're understanding the elements that have gone into feeding that strategic plan, right? Because they take dependencies on things like data, right? And
Mhm.
then the quality of data will definitely help. So you wrote an interesting article, which resonated with me quite a bit. Was go slow to go fast. So what was that about? Because I know you touched a bit of that on data. You
Yeah,
talked about data stewardship and who should own it, right? And do you want to? I think it'll be great for you to sort of share your thoughts on what you
sure.
meant by go slow and go fast.
Yeah. So I think that phrase I referenced in one of the podcasts we had with Marla Hyman Group back then. And also, I think you're referencing the white paper that I wrote around the data strategy and all
Yeah.
of that as well to combine. I really still do believe go slow to go fast. So operations, there's so many facets of what we touch as an organization in supporting the sales organization and ensuring that the go-to-market plan is executed against. And it's very easy for operations functions to get caught up in just managing the day-to-day and reacting to ad hoc requests. And as organizations grow and you figure out how to scale, the foundations around data, going from data hygiene, data cleanliness, is everybody aligned on how we're capturing a data and how we're calculating metrics, right? So metrics is another piece where we may already know these are the key metrics we want to measure ourselves against. But when it comes down to, okay, how are we going to track that? And what are the calculations that we use against those metrics? POC as an example, right? Pre-sales world, POC conversion, POC attach rate, those are important. But it would be surprising if you talk to different people, if you haven't gotten that alignment, well, how are you calculating POC conversion? And
Hmm.
that's all also dependent on the level of data and detail you're capturing related to POC, how consistent the sales teams are and pre-sales teams are in capturing that data. So there's so many other dynamics that I think is that next layer of data hygiene, data cleanliness, data strategy, to be honest, that should include alignment on how are we calculating some of these metrics. And don't work off assumptions. Those things, as you can imagine, Dharmesh, right? It takes time, because if there is an alignment, you sometimes have to drive that alignment cross-functionally. And if one group is defining a metric a one way and another group is another way, and that's how they've historically, even marketing, right? How are they defining pipeline conversion? It seems very simple, but you'd be surprised depending on the complexity of your organization and the sales stage handoffs from marketing to sales. Are we looking at it the same way? And I think working on those foundations, driving the alignment, things that take time, but that are so critical for us to be able to not have to doubt or question the data and analysis our teams are providing. That's the part of the work that a lot of times takes time and we kind of put on the back burner. Well, we still have to crank out the report, so we'll worry about addressing that alignment. That's a great example of going slow to go fast, in that if you don't get that alignment right the first time, then you're going to continually be having people doubting the data source and the analysis that you're pulling together, which only slows down things in the move forward situation.
Yeah, I think you're so right on that one because that's a piece of where you feel like with the strategy part, right? So like yes, we're always busy, like you said, like sales operations doing a lot of different things, and we're always busy. I don't think anybody in sales ops will say I have a typical day, right? We all have, uh, things that come out of the left side which we've not
Hmm.
planned for, and yes, not taking the time to really think about the big picture sometimes can hurt us in the short term. We might make short term progress, but long term we might suffer. So you talked about data, and data in my mind, right, a lot of people think about it as okay, I'm just going to focus on data quality, not having a clear definition of what that quality means, or I am just So who should be responsible for data? For example, is it ops? Is it sales strategy? Is it leadership as a whole, putting a culture? Like
Yeah.
where? How do we think about data? Because I'm pretty sure you've come into Akamai, right? So you jumped into Akamai, and now that train is already moving when you get on from an
Mhm.
ops perspective, and you got to fix things, right? And when people talk about data, they'll say my CRM sucks because the data in a CRM sucks. And I always think whether from an ops perspective, it's a case of tail wagging the dog. Like I can't do what I need to do because my CRM data sucks, or do I need to take the time to fix my CRM data and get ahead? So like, how do you sort of make the transition?
Yeah, it's a good question, especially when you're moving into an organization that already has something in place, right? Versus
Yeah.
coming into maybe a smaller organization where you have the opportunity to build things from scratch, which is a little bit easier to be more nimble and make adjustments as you go. The larger the organization, the more complex the process, the more diverse the stakeholder groups are. And so there's a lot more stakeholder management you have to do. So it takes time to that point, which is probably the situation, like you said, I jumped in, joined Akamai, and we already have certain things in place. In the data strategy white paper that I published while I was still at CSO Insights, we really kind of outlined that the chief sales officer or chief revenue officer, whatever the equivalent might be, really should be the kind of the so-called owner of the sales data strategy. Now,
Mm.
in a more larger organization, there are more complex dynamics where enterprise-wide data strategy may be managed more centrally by a dedicated team, a lot of times involving IT, understandably. But in that white paper, we specifically called out sales data strategy, as in how should sales use the data that our teams are capturing in our social truths, which is typically CRM, and how we publish it. And of course, it's a component of a larger enterprise-wide data discussion. But if we just look at the sales angle for a second, then you can say the keepers of the data hygiene, the data cleanliness, should be sales ops or revenue ops, right?
Mm.
Depending on your organizational structure. But the message is stronger and more meaningful when you have the sales leader at the CSO level, the highest level, really be the owner of the sales data strategy. And being an owner of it is not just the, hey, I'm the executive sponsor, so I'll send the message out. They really have to invest the time and really support the strategy, building the strategy around, with operations helping execute against that strategy again. So as an example, right, a lot of times I think when companies take on data strategy, you have the executive sales leader send out a message saying, hey, this is important. The data is only as good as what you guys are updating. But you may not actually be seeing them actively inquiring about the data as much, right?
Mm.
Especially in large organizations. It's like a kickoff message. And then you may hear periodically, quarterly. That's really a sponsor. It's not the actual owner of the strategy. They really need to be questioning it every single time on the assumption that there are analysis that we're providing, and it should be part of whatever cadence you have. Deal reviews, forecast reviews, they should be actually logging into the tools that their teams are using and actively communicating, whether it's account plans or forecast dashboards. If there's a messaging capability, they should be in there and periodically kind of spot checking and inspecting. And so there's a micromanagement aspect to it, but you can do this in a way that it's more of a, hey, the leaders are actually looking at the data quality, not just, saying it as a kickoff for a project as an executive sponsor. And I think that really changes the dynamic of helping shift the entire organization, because this is a behavior change, right? It's,
Yeah.
a lot of people listen to frontline managers, they're direct managers the most. And a top down message is a top down message. And so it also needs to kind of trickle down to each management level as well, besides starting with the highest level executive sales leader really having a vested interest in making sure the data quality is there, because only then can they really rely on the reports that we're compiling and the analysis we're compiling without questioning, with any doubt, well, should I really trust this data or not?
Yeah. So we need to have the leadership needs to sponsor it. They need to make sure it's being executed by doing the spot checks, making the frontline managers accountable. And of course, IT has a role to play as well in terms
Yep.
of sort of uh, enabling the data cleanup functionality and all the things that need to happen. So, shifting gears a little bit, like sales strategy generally is perceived as the guys who are doing the annual planning cycle, right? So they create the plan and they roll it off. Uh, what do they do through the rest of the year? Right? Has it changed now with COVID? Are we planning more often, or are they getting more? Is ops team driving a lot of the feedback?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Depending on whether your organization has a separate sales strategy focused team, in addition to sales operations, which at times they might be part of a larger sales operations team, and I've experienced some of that at larger companies as well. Um, I think the best practice that we hear a lot about is it should be an ongoing discussion, not
Mm,
just a one time. I think what's challenging as a reality check is executing against changes that happen too frequently.
mm,
Um, what I have heard in recent discussions around COVID, right, with sales and sales operations forums, is more companies are considering like a half year plan,
mm.
which gives them the ability to shift if needed,
Yeah,
with situations like COVID as an example, right?
yeah,
At the same time, everybody is aware that makes it more operationally challenging for the operations team because it's essentially like doing an annual plan twice a year. So I think it's kind of the balance of, do you want the flexibility to be able to pivot and adjust in times like these? Um, or, would you rather adjust in different ways, and different levers, comp or, quota levers, to adjust in these situations and go back to an annual plan? That's really up to each organization and, what they feel they are capable of supporting for the business. But that's one example of it's happening more than once a quarter in some situations where companies have adopted a kind of half year plan. It
yeah.
forces you to have that discussion. I think the other piece also with strategy is, we also can't just look at annual plan, right? Typically, maybe strategies are 3, 5 year plans, and then you focus on the annual. There's other considerations that we really should be looking at. If your companies are doing M&A, how much of that and the progress of merger or acquisition from prior year, if there were a couple of year plans built in, are we integrating that into the planning process? My experience, maybe some companies do a better job of that than others. I think M&A is also seen as a, hey, we have a plan. Once they become part of the organization, maybe we're not looking at what the original, 1, 2, 3 year plan from the M&A process was as part of the annual planning cycle. So there are, I think, other things that you should be including into that input process. Um, More and more, I think it makes more sense for the strategy part of the discussion, whether it's like driven or part of what operations does, where you would need a dedicated team because you're going to be asking your team that's managing everything to take on something else. But if it's part of a same organization, at least there's a dialogue, versus if it's a very separate group, right?
That's an interesting point. So, like, where do you see them reporting? Do you see them generally reporting to the same team, or what you're saying is they should be reporting into the same team and at least have some sort of alignment,
Yeah,
uh,
I mean,
right?
reporting into the same team still requires alignment and discussion, right?
Yeah,
So let's say, I think, again, every company is different, so I don't want to just kind of blanket presume, but sometimes there's a corporate wide, enterprise wide strategy discussion, then there is the sales specific strategy.
yeah,
So I think it could be that you may have more focus groups within sales that may report into sales, or a larger kind of operations group that the operations team, like the day to day geo-functional operations team, are a part of. That's one example I've seen. Others where maybe they report into the sales leader, but again, there should be that alignment.
yeah.
In other scenarios, it's really more at the enterprise level where those strategic discussions are happening. And then that really is managed more via, I would say, messaging from the sales executive leader, or let's say in this case, an operations leader, whether COO or like a global operations team that is larger than the typical sales ops function we typically have in mind. They may be the glue to kind of funnel that back into their teams. So whether it's a reporting line or not, I think the communication and the partnership is key either way, whether through
Agreed.
leaders back to the operations team and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. Like also, I think the alignment between ops and strategy, irrespective of the organization. Sometimes ops guys are also reporting to finance, but that should not stop it. They need to have the alignment with strategy.
Yeah.
Strategy is a little more than just the annual planning cycle. They have to look at 3 and 5 years old. And yes, you're right. Sometimes the corporate strategy team is doing the M&A, but sales strategy needs to sort of really look at that as well and start thinking of those things. Yeah, we've seen. Interestingly, companies are now even looking at, I'm going to do a quarterly plan with this, every quarter I'm going to look for the next 18 months kind of thing. And the other piece is what one of the things that we've heard is they're like, yes, our plan in Excel is planned, but the reality is things are changing in the field. People are changing roles, people are leaving the company. We need all that fed in, and that's where the ops and the strategy partnership needs to come together really well. You mentioned something earlier, which is really interesting, is around quota setting, right? Because it's at the end of the day, quota is important. But before we get to, I want to understand, get your thoughts on how best to set quota. But before we get there, one of the reports that you shared with me when you were at CSO Insights was how low the attainment number. They were actually historically low attainment numbers, despite an explosion of all these tools that we have. And it was interesting to me because I spent a lot of time sort of thinking about why is that case. I have my own opinion, but we'd love to get your thoughts when you were doing research. Why is attainment numbers so low when we've equipped the sales teams and ops teams, everybody with more data, more tools?
So having come back into the ops world from the research world, where we did at CSO Insights publish that data point, there's the explosion of the tools that are available that you would presume, right, should lead to improved sales productivity with automation and all of that, so they could really focus on going after the new customers and renewal of the existing customers, that you should see an improvement in quota attainment. And I think the research data that was interesting there that we wrote around is, and I think we experienced this with any company, it really goes back to the fundamentals again. If we're a couple of things, right? When we make the tools available, the tools are only usable because of the quality of the data. So again, it's back to basics, right? If you throw so many tools, but the data is not scrubbed or aligned or consistent, or it's not reliable, nobody's going to use the tool after the initial rollout because they just can't trust it.
And each tool is giving its own data input, right?
Exactly. So I think that's the initial hurdle, right? Is we can purchase all these tools, make it available, but if the data is only as good as the quality of the original data that is pulling from typically CRMs, then the moment sales users see some discrepancy in their deal or something, we're like, well, that's not what I put in CRM. Why am I seeing it here? Or why is it coming up this way? They'll stop using it. That's one piece. The second piece, I think, is, let's say you've overcome that hurdle. The next piece is, how are we then, when we make all these tools available to the sales teams, are we helping them understand when to use what tool for what purpose? And a lot of times, a lot of us throw all these tools out there, whether it's for outbound calling, in addition to CRM, that is, right? Typically these things go on top, or we may create tons of dashboards that are available for them. But if we just throw it out as here's another tool available for you, or here is a dashboard that we've now made available, with so much going on with sales, just engaging with customers, if we don't really also add in the business context or the use case of how you can effectively use it, I think it just becomes, hey, we have tons of dashboards, but how do we use it? People aren't really seeing the value, because to be able to use the dashboards effectively, you do have to commit to actually using it, right? Going in there, studying, understanding the functionality, as with any new tool. So that's the first step. And the other piece, I think, is the management enforcement, right? Are we also training our managers how to effectively use the tools to help them better coach their teams? How do they use it in deal reviews? If you have a monthly cadence for certain forecast reviews, whether it's pipeline review or renewal reviews or whatever it is you're setting up as part of your cadence, are you enabling them to understand how to use the tools that we're making them available against those processes? So I think those are some of the things you need to look at that probably every organization kind of has challenges with. And having done change management full time, a true believer in having a thought out change management plan that's not just an implementation based communication and training, but also helping others understand why we're investing in a certain tool and how it's going to help them from the very early stages. I think that's very key as well.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. We always overlook explaining the why we are embracing a tool. And if people don't understand the why, they're not invested in really spending time in it or making use of it. It was if they use it, they will give us feedback, and we can always do better. But if they don't choose, the worst thing is they just walk away from this tool. We never find out, and we
Yeah.
got that we pay for it, and yeah, I think completely all right. So shifting back to the other piece on Coda, then, uh, what in your mind are some of the challenges in setting quota, right? And actually, the other piece is, uh, do you see people trying to do quotas, redo quotas now because of COVID? Are we changing the windows of how often quotas getting resets, right? And like, what are some of the issues that you're seeing related to quota now?
Yeah, I think COVID is a unique situation. It's one of those, I think, impacts that probably we didn't really, many companies probably didn't take into account the level of impact it would have. So, a lot of the different forums that I have been part of, I think initially in the beginning of the year when the COVID impact was starting to show up in pockets, more companies were, you know, what the survey results that I've seen at least out there available is that more were kind of on standby to see if they
Mm,
need to do something, but we're considering it. Now that we're kind of, for those of us who are on the calendar year as a fiscal year cycle schedule, they're probably starting to see more impact in pockets in specific verticals, as an example, right? As we would expect, that may be more of a consideration of what, we do need to do something.
mm.
That's the change in dynamic that I've seen in the different forums that I've joined recently as well. Um, Regarding the challenge with quota, I think that's a very open question. I think it's going to vary, but in general, based on my experience, I think the challenge typically is kind of balancing the top down with the bottoms up, and how do you connect the two, right?
So have you seen companies preferring one or the other, or do you recommend them to do both?
My Based on my experience, I would recommend trying to balancing doing both.
Okay.
And part of it, I think, is really also tied to the fact that the bottoms up really represents kind of what the frontline teams are seeing, right down to the regional manager level, let's say. And at times there are variances at the region or district or whatever is your lowest level hierarchy at the management level that may be unique, and the impact may be more significant at that lower level than at the higher geo or division level or business unit level, however you're deciding the top down level to be. And I think, operations plays a key role in helping determine and flag and raise a hand to say, it might be a simple top down exercise from the top down. But when we look at it from a bottoms up, that percent allocation down to this frontline level has a significant impact for these reasons. Whether take COVID as an example, right? So particular regions or districts may have a more negative impact because they are very heavily focused in a particular vertical that's impacted by COVID, and or there may be accounts that are assigned within a patch that happen to all be in travel and hospitality, let's say, right, that they're going to be more significantly impacted. So you just can't take that top down approach too much without understanding those dynamics. And the operations teams, have a handle on what are those nuances that need to be called out, so that we're not just saying yes to the top down, but we're trying to kind of balance both approach and give, in my mind, we give kind of like a guideline or a guardrail, you could say, And yet we give room for the leaders and the operations teams to kind of work within those guidelines with a little bit of flexibility. And yes, it's easier said than done. But when you are able to balance that and acknowledge the need to balance that, I think you have a better approach to quota setting methodology than you would from one or the other approach.
I agree. I think that's what we experience as well is that the ops people in general are playing arbitrage between the tops down and the bottom of feedback, right? Tops down, a lot of the managers may not have, leaders may not have a full insight into the challenges that are happening in
Yeah.
the field. They get a number top down and say, we have to grow to 20%, let's make that up. And the field may have different perspective, like you said, based on vertical, based on territory. And critical part of the ops team here is to then be that sounding board to say like what is real, what is the number, because if you don't set it right, yes, you can disincent the sales team and may
Mhm.
see your best reps leave because the quota was not set the right way. But I've seen, I think the biggest piece, what I've seen is it's hard for companies to do both of those things in a compressed time frame that
Yes.
we're talking, right? And so the magic is to get it done fast, in order to do that. Um, how do you think, how do you see, uh, are there any best practices or guidance that you give in terms of uh, making sure that even in these environment right now with everything changing, right? Uh, how do you make sure that the reps are enabled the right way? I mean, a lot of them are, like you said, some verticals are gone, right? And for a while at least, right? Uh, so how do you deal with the reps that are impacted? Like I mean, I'm not sure. Akamai probably has its own issues with verticals that are doing very well. Some verticals not doing as well. Uh, how do you focus on the enablement side? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, just to clarify, Dharmesh, when you say enablement, what do you include in
So,
that?
actually, that's a great point. I would love to know from you, like, what do you think? Because you talk about strategy and operations, where you've not generally talked about enablement. We all talked about, like you said, adoption of tools is a great thing that needs to happen. Uh, we throw enablement generally in my mind, right? This is me, like, oh, we have boot camps. They do boot camps. They train the reps. They give them the sales playbook. But what is their role in driving the alignment between strategy and operations?
So, just to clarify the question, you're asking specifically the sales enablement functions
Correct.
role, right?
Role. Yeah.
Um, it's a really good question. I think having worked with Tamara Schenk, who was the sales enablement guru on the CSO Insights analyst team, we were very much aligned, and I still, firmly believe in this as well now, that ops and enablement should have a partnership.
Mm.
And we may not always work on the same things, right? For obvious reasons. However, where we have an opportunity to do so, we should. And I think the enablement role, to take as an example, let's say we're reviewing forecast reviews, right? And in the context of right now, we understand that there are certain things that are impacting what we have in our pipeline and what we're closing due to COVID impacts or certain verticals or whatnot. In that scenario, operations might be driving the forecast cadence and the discussions and the report that pulls up into it and managing the systems that support that visibility. But then there are the actual deal reviews that are a key input into driving the forecast discussions at the executive or division or unit level that you might have. And enablement really plays a key role in helping managers better coach their teams to ask the right questions to qualify the deals better. So that's an
Mm.
example of where you have the forecast, which is more of a operations team led environment, that the enablement participation from a deal review, better coaching, maybe opportunity qualification methodology, whatever it is your organization wants to roll out or is using, you have an opportunity to partner on that. And how do we incorporate, let's say, some of those opportunity methodology data points into the forecast calls? Whether it's flags and reports that we have, what percent completion of the methodology that's now part of the sales process in Salesforce.com field did this deal review to help you determine the level of forecast accuracy, right? How reliable is the quality of this opportunity in the pipeline. So that's one example of a where operations can and enablement can partner outside of the traditional, right? What comes to mind? Boot camps,
Yeah.
sales tools, and all of that. That enablement, might be helping as well. So.
So like the win loss reviews, get the data from there, figure out where to invest.
Hmm.
No, excellent. We're almost on time. I could go on and on and on. Actually, with you and I have chatted on this quite a bit on these things and the value of strategy and operations. Any final thoughts from yourself? And by the way, we for folks who's still on, you can ask questions as well. There's an ask a question at the bottom. You can feel free to shoot us questions. This is our all of us together investing the time in this. So this is not just Yuri and me. But any final thoughts from your side, Yuri, on as you think about what can organizations do to drive better alignment around strategy and operations? I heard organizationally, irrespective of where we sit, we still need to partner together. Strategy needs to think within 3 to 5 years, but also need to see what it takes to get that strategy operational right now. Data
Hmm.
plays a key part. Ops can help them become more agile. What you said is taking the strategy and making it actionable. Anything else that you think we should make sure that people consider when we drive
Yeah.
alignment?
No, it's a good question. One of the things that I was reminded that, again, this is where, I came from the best practice research world and moved back into actually doing ops. And it was a good reminder is, especially if you have a sales ops or revenue operations team and you're in a leadership role as well. And even if you aren't and you want to contribute to that discussion, I think one of the things that I can't stress enough, having come from kind of so called saying, hey, this is the best practice to do, but having been reminded, no wonder this is the best practice, having doing ops now, is literally the phrasing of go slow to go fast. At times, we have so many things we have to prioritize against, right? Including with continual engagement with the strategy team if one does exist in your organization. Um, and sometimes it's easy to say, oh, I'm going to just cancel that meeting that I had with the strategy team, right? Whether it's a monthly touch point or whatnot, because I have other priorities to prioritize against. Don't undermine the importance of those engagements, especially when we talk about the strategy and operations team alignment. Those quarterly or monthly or however many cadence calls you have, make sure you keep that on your calendar unless there's critical deliverables. But if you are going to, then just reschedule, don't cancel. Those calls are the most important things that I think that I've been reminded of, that when you try to prioritize and you push out or cancel some of those, cadence calls that you have in place, there's a reason why. But also to make those meetings productive, be clear on the outcomes you want to get out of them. And if you don't have an agenda, then maybe it's a reason to say, hey, do we need to meet today or do we push it out by another month or a couple of weeks? But don't cancel and not reschedule.
Excellent.
Because the go slow to go fast is a combination of that, as well as we also need to make sure that we actually build time in our calendars to think about the future of your organization. So let's say you're talking about a year or two, 3 year plan. Here's what we're going to do. Don't forget to plan for the operations team and the support model your team's going to need as the sales organization looks to grow. I think
Yeah.
that's a pitfall we fall into, is we become a simple budget line item. But in order to be able to continue to support a growing organization, you have to always keep that in mind. And that means whether it's enabling your teams, upskilling them, training them on things, making tools available, that takes time. And you need to make sure that your leaders are aligned, that operations, needs to grow with the sales organization if that's part of the plan. So I kind of mix a couple of different things in there, but those are all examples of where you need to spend time, not just, reacting and prioritizing to whatever might be coming top down. That's net new. Because if you don't have that strategy in mind, you may be veered off your path, being reactive to something, and you will never move the needle from where you are now to where you want to get to. So,
Excellent. I think that was a great summary, right? Have an agenda, make sure you have those checkpoint meetings. We have outcomes defined that we're working towards. I think that's a great summary of how we need to do to think fast. sorry, go fast to go slow to go fast. Um, and I would love to, maybe actually there's a separate session on just ROI justification of the investment in ops, because that's the other part. I think that we should have a separate discussion on that one. Is sales leaders think of ops as a cost center because it's not a revenue generating head, right? And how do we make ops more strategic so that people can quantify ROI investment? That will be for another session. I'd love to sort of discuss that with you. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody. Hope you found the session useful. Tuesday is 11 a.m. Every week, and we will have a topic for next week posted shortly. Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you.